right, good morning. Let me just add my welcome to those of you who are coming back here for the first time. For those who are coming back, welcome back. For those of you who are leaving, goodbye. We'll be praying for you as you kind of move into new transitions in life. We are in a transition here at Shawnee Hills. I mean, it's fairly obvious because I'm up here. And if you've been coming the last several weeks/months, we've had a lot of other people who have come here and challenged us. And I don't know about you, but we've heard some really great messages over the last several months. And I've really appreciated the people who have come from the outside to kind of challenge us and encourage us in this kind of time of transition. But I'm coming to you as one of us. I am a member of this group. And so when I was asked to share this morning, it's like, okay, what can I say to my brothers and sisters in this local body that would be an encouragement to them? And how can I do that in a kind of a one-shot type of deal, which is always sort of difficult, because I really like teaching Sunday school because if I'm working through a book, I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. It kind of goes in line. But if I have to pick something one shot, I mean, here I am. So that's what I'm going to try to do this morning, is we're going to talk about the concept of worldly wisdom versus godly wisdom. Now, we got this report from the pulpit committee. You have 60 resumes. Wow. Now, I'm glad I'm not on the pulpit committee. Because I have trouble when I go to like Olive Garden or Cheesecake Factory, and there's so many good things on the menu. It's like I don't know how to choose. Right? How many of you have this kind of same issue here? Okay, so I'm glad it's you guys and not me that's doing that. But this morning, as we kind of talk about this issue of godly wisdom, worldly wisdom, in the end, the pulpit committee is going to go through these resumes. They're going to sort people out. They're going to do that, and then they're going to present someone to us. Ultimately, we make the decision. Ultimately, we call a pastor. It's not the pulpit committee that calls a pastor. And so as we kind of go into this decision-making process about thinking who will be the next senior pastor of Shawnee Hills, it kind of gives us a chance to reflect on how are we going to choose somebody. Okay? And not just as we think about issues of choosing a pastor, how do we choose anything? Okay? What is the decision-making process? What is the kind of standard or goal that we sort of use to know whether we're making wise decisions or not? And so this is really what I kind of want to address today. And I also want you to know that in a sense, even though we're going to be looking at James chapter 3 in quite a bit of detail this morning, I'm preaching a hymn as well to you. And we're going to sing that hymn at the end of the service. And hopefully the words of the message, and we're kind of going through this concept of earthly versus or worldly versus godly wisdom, will kind of resonate when we sing the hymn at the end. Hopefully you can see the connections between the two. All right. Now, if you think about going to a restaurant, making a big decision, or making a decision off the menu. I mean, going to a restaurant, I hope it's not a big decision for you, right? But oftentimes, we tend to choose things that make us comfortable. If you've been to, if we go out to eat, oftentimes, depending on where we go, I can predict what Teresa's going to order off the menu, right? Because there's certain things she likes, she feels comfortable with, and so she's going to choose those things. Right? So if we go to Los Mariachis, it's going to be the mariachi chicken. It's just like, that's just the way it's going to be, right? Because even though there's a lot of good things on the menu, right? So we tend to choose things, or we tend to kind of go with things that we're comfortable with. Now, that's okay when you're dealing with the mariachi chicken, I guess, at Los Mariachis. But in a time of transition, it really gives us a chance to kind of think about what are the standards that we're going to use to choose a pastor, okay, or anything else. And a couple weeks ago, we were kind of given the results of a survey that we took to kind of see what we were looking for in a pastor. And I don't know, it's always good to kind of quantify, I guess, what the attitude of the group is. and it's good to see whether your intuitions of things kind of match everybody else's, but I don't know that there was anything particularly really surprising here. When I looked at this, I thought, this is what I thought we would pretty much pick. Right? It was good to have that quantified for me. But it kind of begs the question, if that's what we are saying that we want, is it maybe something that we're comfortable with? And if we're comfortable with that, may it also cause us to sometimes miss certain other things that we should be looking for? And so what I want to kind of do today is kind of look at what are God's standards for how we should be making decisions of any type, whether it's a pastor or anything else. And I kind of use the pastor issue just as kind of an example. If you think about what a pastor is for a congregation, okay? Oftentimes a pastor is our representative, right? He kind of embodies what we think we should be as believers, right? So on our list, we wanted someone who preaches well, and we wanted someone who kind of has been to seminary and kind of discern the word, and we wanted somebody who is married because we think that's a good thing, or most of us thought that was a pretty good thing. And so the pastor sort of becomes the embodiment of who we think he should be. He kind of embodies our values. Okay? So pastors are representatives. Okay? But pastors are also shepherds. It's another kind of way of looking at this. And when we think about a pastor as a shepherd, he's to be who Christ wants him to be. And he's to kind of help mold us into who Christ wants us to be. And so when we need chastening, the pastor needs to chasten us. And when we need encouraging, he needs to encourage us. And hopefully those two things are the same. Our values, pastor as our representative, God's values, pastor is our shepherd. Okay? And if those things are together, that's great. And I'm not suggesting to us that, in our case, that those are necessarily far apart. Okay? But they can have a tendency, because our values versus God values, they can have a tendency to separate. And I think many a person has been pushed from the ministry because they could not be all things to all people, because they had to try to embrace everyone's different image of who they were supposed to be. So as we kind of get into this time, we're in this time of transition, I think it's a good time for us to kind of examine, how do we go about making decisions? And so that's what I'd like to do here today, because if you don't, the result can be a lot of division and a lot of quarreling and a lot of fighting, and churches end up splitting over issues like this. And I'm not suggesting that this is going to happen to us at all, but I think it's a good time for us to kind of step back and look at the whole issue. So we're going to deal with this issue of wisdom here today. And normally when we think about wisdom, where do we normally start? Book of Proverbs, don't we? All right, so turn up Proverbs chapter 9, because that's usually where people want to go when we think about wisdom. And Proverbs is a good place, because in Proverbs there's the contrast between Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly. And as the first several chapters of Proverbs go, the writer keeps kind of contrasting these two views for us. But note, we have this kind of encapsulating statement in Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10, and many of you can quote it, or at least you can quote the first part of the verse. Right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge, and I lost it, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Right? So when we think about this idea of wisdom, wisdom starts with what? It starts with reverence. It starts with awe. It's the fear of the Lord. Now, if you think, and then look what the writer says here. And knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. In essence, knowledge is preceded by what? Wisdom. Normally, when and this is kind of counterintuitive for most of us. Most of us, when we think about wisdom, wisdom is knowledgeable people taking what they know and applying it well. But know what the author of Proverbs is telling us. That wisdom really precedes knowledge. Because if you have wisdom, if you have the fear of the Lord, it is going to guide even what you think is worth knowing. It guides the process of what you choose to learn. Okay? If I think that learning to be a triathlete is a good thing, it's going to drive my understanding. It's going to maybe drive me to looking at certain types of magazines and certain television shows and things like that. So my standard of what is good precedes even my understanding of what is good knowledge. And that really is kind of counterintuitive to us, because most of the time we think that wisdom is knowledge applied. Well, I really want to suggest that what wisdom really is knowledge well applied. Well, what does that mean? Okay. It means that whenever we approach this idea of wisdom, wisdom must have a target. Wisdom must have a goal. When you're choosing to learn something so that you can progress toward a certain goal or vision of that which is good. So we send people to school, for example, to become more knowledgeable. But what we choose to teach them, or we could teach them anything, okay? But we choose to teach them certain subjects. Why do we teach them those subjects? Because we think that those are the types of subjects that will allow them to get along well in the world. So we have a vision of what is good that drives what we even choose to learn or teach people. So when we think about this idea of wisdom, we have to start with this idea of wisdom as a vision of the good. Okay? And not simply that wisdom comes out of knowing something. Right? In fact, if you think about it, we know lots of intelligent people, very bright people, who don't start with this fear or knowledge of the Lord. And what do they do with their intelligence and knowledge? They oftentimes will use it as a tool to sort of continue in their unbelief. They defend their bad ideas or their irreverent ideas or their idea that God doesn't exist, okay, by using their intelligence or knowledge. They have a vision that starts and it guides how they look at knowledge and information. So when we begin to think about this idea of wisdom, we first have to start with a fear, reverence, awe of God. Now, the passage in James, it's kind of interesting when you look at the Old Testament, and particularly you look at Proverbs, we're contrasting Lady Wisdom, Lady Folly. If you look at, let's say, Ecclesiastes, in Ecclesiastes, the author of Ecclesiastes kind of goes through and talks about all the things that he's done and all the things that he's pursued. And in the end, he comes to the conclusion that everything was vanity or everything was folly. And so he says that, look, everything I tried to pursue was not very good. I should have remembered my Creator in the days when I was young. And he says I should have had a different vision for life. Okay? James, on the other hand, is going to be a little bit more nuanced for us. Okay? What James is telling us is that there are two types of wisdom. James has kind of laid out that who's wise among you? And then he talks about the idea that there's worldly wisdom, and he's talking about that there is godly wisdom. Now, remember, wisdom is a vision of what is right or what is good. Right? So what James is really telling us is that there are two visions of what is right or what is good. And we choose to pursue one of those visions. You can pursue a vision of worldly good. Okay? And the world defines good in a certain way. Or you can choose to pursue godly wisdom or the godly standard of the good. But what we'll see is you cannot pursue both. So James kind of lays out for us that there really are two types of visions of the good, two competing ideas of virtue, and says that you need to choose between the one of them. And he kind of lays out the differences for us. We'll come back and look at these here in a minute. But the kind of interesting thing to note here for me, I think, is that when we begin to think about this idea of virtue and good, we need to kind of understand that there's a difference between moral ideas and ethical ideas. Now, normally we understand those as sort of synonymous. In fact, we use them synonymously, and that's technically not right. Okay? You act morally as an individual. Okay? When you act and you do an action, whether it's a good or a bad action, that is an exercise in your morality. Okay? But generally, when you do that, you will do it from some sort of ethical standard, which is corporate. So if you are a good member of Shawnee Hills Baptist Church, how do you know you're a good member? Because there's sort of a corporate sort of understanding of what it means to be good here. Okay? And you live within that corporate idea of goodness. Okay? And if you act that way, we kind of applaud you and pat you on the back and say, yes, you're a good Christian, way to go. And if you kind of are outside of that, we sort of have our little ways of letting you know, no, you're not quite in there, right, okay. And hopefully, if you still want to be part of us, you kind of mold your attitudes back to get within the good. Make sense? Now, the same thing operates if you think about the larger society. There is a concept out there of what it means to be a good American. And if you're a good American, you hold to certain ideas and you hold to certain values. And we'll let you know that you're a good American if, in fact, you live according to those values and attitudes and virtues and you pursue life that way. And most of us, because we live within that environment, we sort of tend to respond to that because we are communal beings. And so if we begin to understand that these ideas of ethics are really waters that we swim in, and because they're waters that we swim in, they do affect us. And so when we go out there, and we are in the bigger ethics of the culture, there are certain attitudes and values that are pressing on us that say, you are a good American if you do this. And the tendency could be that we could bring those attitudes, values, concepts of the good, and bring them into here, where they may not quite align with what God wants us to be and think and act and do. So when we begin to kind of think about James telling us, look, there are two types of virtue, there are two types of wisdom, and you need to choose the right one, he's really kind of saying choose as a group, as a community, you need to kind of choose the right ethical vision from which to follow. Now, I want you to think about the vision of the good that is out there for a minute. What does our society, what does our world try to tell us? If you think about it, there are competing messages that we get. For example, fairness is more important than justice in our society. And fairness is, I need to get mine. It needs to be me. Okay? Justice related more toward what's good for the community. We seem as a society to be much more interested in things like consuming goods, which is, I consume them, okay, as compared to creating goods, which would be for the benefit of everyone. Okay? We seem to be much more interested in things like fame. Fame is pretty important to us, rather than really truly accomplishing something. I mean, why in the world is Ryan Seacrest so famous? Okay. What has he done? I mean, he's got the best job in the world. He gets to be on TV for the simple reason that he's famous. What have you done? I don't know, but I'm famous. Okay, we'll put you on. Okay, what a great gig to have. All right, but glamour and beauty seem to be more important than character. Image is more important than holiness. I mean, there was a tagline for Sprite once, image is everything. Okay? Just as kind of an example, think about how people get their news now. Most people tend to get their news from sources that agree with their own opinion. Okay? We've sort of substituted opinion for true knowledge. And what that ends up doing in the end, again, all of these, me versus the group, me versus the group, me versus the group, in the end, this becomes very divisive. Okay? It tends to pull apart at us. In the end, we start treating other people as competitors. It divides us. We see people as the enemy. In many ways, we turn to objectify people. Oh, he's just an idiot for believing that. Okay? And what doesn't happen is we don't have unity. Okay? We tend to end up with division. Now, this is sort of exactly what James predicts. So if you kind of turn to James chapter 3, the passage that we read this morning, note that James really does kind of lay out certain characteristics of what happens if you follow this worldly vision. What are the results of this? And he notes that the first one is bitter jealousy. What he means here is that we seek our own benefit. We're not willing to share with others. James, as he uses this term, he uses it in sort of a religious context. It kind of leads to a type of religious zeal or zealotry. And if you kind of think about the history of religion throughout the centuries, there's been an awful lot of times where religion has been used, whether we're talking Christianity or other religions, have been used to sort of promote a particular agenda, an us versus them kind of mentality. Okay? And he notes that this is sort of one of the characteristics of worldly wisdom. We are prone to selfish ambitions. We seek to promote our own ends. And we tend to do that at the exclusion of other people. So we start to use people if we can. In fact, I will try to pursue certain ways of gaining power so that I can pursue my agenda over your agenda. Okay? And that might mean acquiring wealth, because wealth gives me power. Okay? It might mean gaining position, because position could give me power. It might mean cultivating beauty, because beauty and sex appeal may give me power over people. But there's lots of ways that we can go to cultivate power. And all of those kind of come out of this idea of selfish ambition, because this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to seek our own end. Arrogance. Note that James tells us that worldly wisdom leads to a type of arrogance. What it means is that you believe in yourself. Okay? You believe in your own vision. It's a type of, James is kind of laying out, it's your sovereignty, it's your desire for autonomy that comes out, and it makes you arrogant. Now suddenly, your vision of the world becomes the vision for the world. And everyone has to sort of get in line with what you think is the right thing to do. That's self-deception. Okay? Notice that sometimes we become unwilling and unable to learn from others. We become unteachable at a certain level. Part of that is because of this arrogance that is cultivated, but part of it is that we are unwilling to see things at the way they really are. Okay? In the end, all of this leads to division. As worldly wisdom continues to grow, and as worldly wisdom sort of becomes the wisdom for a group of people, the end result will always be, as James says, division. It will lead to quarreling. It will lead to fighting. It will lead to everyone, it leads to, as Jesus said, a house divided, which will not stand. Because everyone is now doing, as the author of Judges says, everyone's doing right what is right in their own eyes. Okay? So in the end, worldly wisdom, James kind of points out, has this divisive, this corrosive, this kind of effect that pulls people apart. Because now everyone wants to pursue their own end. Now, obviously when we present this characteristic of worldly wisdom, it doesn't look too attractive, does it? It's like, no, I don't want to be that. In fact, I'm not that anyway. Okay? I am more godly in this regard. Okay? Because you can lay out this way, worldly, godly, okay? These people don't look very nice. And you don't really want to be around people like this. Okay? Which begs the question, might we be people like this? We certainly don't want to think that we are. Okay? Now, James, you have to understand, James is probably the first book of the New Testament that was written. And James is a sort of, if anything else about James, he's really a good psychologist. James understands the human heart. And he understands in our sin nature, what our natural inclinations, what our natural affections tend to lead us. And he's sort of warning us that be careful of this, because if you do this, this is what's going to happen. And so he's kind of letting us know that there is this type of wisdom that can be corrosive if you let it take hold of you. Okay? Now, it's kind of interesting that James writes this, and then several decades later, we find this whole issue coming to fruition in another church. And another writer of a New Testament book, the Apostle Paul, finds that he has to address it. And he has to address it in the book of 1 Corinthians, because the church in Corinth is actually sort of exhibiting the very things that James warned of in his book. So when we get to 1 Corinthians, we have a church that is highly divided. And if you kind of read through the first chapter of 1 Corinthians, we have the issue of all kinds of things going on. One of the things that comes out is they're divided over pastors, okay, or who were their pastors, and who they are pledging allegiance to in essence. Okay? Some say, well, I follow Apollos, and I follow Paul, and I follow Cephas or Peter, and there's this other group, probably the holier-than-thou group, right? Well, we follow Christ. Okay? So there's all these kind of factions in the church. Right? And Paul is now kind of writing to go through this because there's lots of quarreling that's going on here. Now, if you go through the book, you'll see that there are issues of division. I mean, whose teachings are they going to follow? There's lack of community around the Lord's table because there's division there. There's strife in the church because people are suing one another. There are people who are priding themselves on their liberty in Christ, and so there's moral laxity going on in the church. There are issues of people pursuing their own ends. Paul has to address the issue of women taking leadership positions. He has to address the issue of people striving for certain spiritual gifts because those gifts are considered of higher status in the church and therefore will give people more power over what's going on there. So there's all kinds of division and strife and things. All the things that, if you notice, were things that James talked about in James chapter 3. So this is a church that's really into it. Okay, they have embraced a sense of kind of worldly wisdom. And Paul, like James, is going to have to note this kind of stuff because they're all kind of pursuing the ends that James had said. Now, let me just kind of point out something about Corinth to you, because normally I think sometimes when we think of Corinth, the equivalent that we have of Corinth is Las Vegas. Right? What happens in Corinth stays in Corinth. Okay? And that would be kind of a wrong view of Corinth, I think. Right? Corinth was not some sort of Roman or Greek cultural backwater. Corinth was not some place that you went to sort of blow off hedonistic steam. Right? Corinth was, if you think about Athens and Rome as the cultural and political centers, okay? And our equivalent would be, let's say, New York and Washington. Okay? Corinth would be like Chicago. Corinth had a striving, it was a big commercial center. It was a center for the arts. It was a center for culture and intellectual pursuits. Certainly there was that hedonistic element that went on in Corinth. But if we think about Corinth only in terms of it was like Las Vegas, we're going to sort of miss sort of what it meant to be a Corinthian. Because what it meant to be a Corinthian was that you were a sort of a cosmopolitan person. A good Corinthian was someone who understood the arts and understood intellectual pursuits. And it's kind of like, we're good New Yorkers because these are all kind of the values of living in the city. If you were a good Corinthian, you kind of embraced this intellectual and cultural and artistic and commercial kind of sense of what it meant to be living in the city. So now when Paul addresses them, and he says to them, if you turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, note what he says to them. He says, brothers, and note, throughout the book, he addresses them as believers. Okay? He addresses them as their brothers, as his brothers. Okay? He acknowledges that they're saved. But he says to them, note, brothers, I wish I could speak to you as spiritual men, but I can't because you are men of flesh, you are babes in Christ. Okay? Now, it kind of begs the question then, what does he mean when he says that they are men of flesh? Or if you have an NIV, it probably says worldly or something like that. Okay? What does he mean by this idea of worldly? Well, let's kind of see if we can find out. What does it mean, in fact, to be worldly? And depending on the translation you have, you may have something like carnal, which I think is in the King James, kind of the Latin word for meat or flesh. Okay? You might have, if you have the ESV, I think it says something like men of flesh. The NASB says fleshly. What is Paul? I mean, that's obvious. We are people of flesh and bone, right? But that's not what he's getting at. He's getting at, okay, I'd like to address you as spiritual people who have a spiritual vision of the good. But I can't because your vision of the good is worldly. Okay? Your affections are placed in the world, whereas I'd really like to talk to you as if your affections were placed on godly concerns. Sort of James's division between worldly wisdom and godly wisdom. All right, so he says to them, look, I'd like to talk to you this way, but I can't because you seem to be worldly. All right, so what does it mean to be worldly? Okay, normally when we think about the term worldly, it's kind of this idea of moral decadence. Okay? He's just a worldly guy. Right? But that's really not what Paul is kind of addressing here, particularly if you can understand this idea of being a good cosmopolitan person as being a good Corinthian. Okay? To be worldly is to be practical or shrewd. It's to have an understanding of human affairs. Okay? It's, here's a vision of what is good in the world, and I know that as I make certain decisions, it brings me closer to that vision. Okay? I do things that will bring me closer to the vision of the good. So, for example, a wise decision is one that helps me to achieve a certain end. An unwise decision is one that's not going to get me there or is actually going to pull me away from it. So as Paul is addressing them, he says, look, your concerns are worldly. You have a worldly vision. And so when you make decisions, what do? You make decisions that will help you to pursue this kind of worldly end. And note what has been happening in this church. There's strife, there's division, there's quarreling, all because they are pursuing an agenda of achieving their own ends. Now, in this respect, for example, I would consider my father as a wise person. Now, my father's not a believer, okay, and he's not particularly well educated. But when he gives me advice, he understands this is what you really need to do if you want to accomplish these goals or these ends. Okay? And so he's pretty good at stuff like that. Okay? But it's not a vision of the good that would be considered necessarily a godly vision. Okay? But he's wise in a worldly sense. Now, so to be ethical in this regard is to be devoted to and pursuing worldly ends. And so when he says to them, look, you guys are worldly because you are pursuing worldly ends. That's really what's going on. Okay? Now, what that really means, because worldly ends almost always focus on me, note that oftentimes in Scripture we get these very black and white contrasting statements. I mean, think about in 1 John where you get some of the best ones. Okay? If you love the world, you can't love God. The love of the Father cannot be in you. Okay? You cannot serve two masters. Okay? You'll either love the one or hate the other. Okay? We see lots of statements like this in Scripture. Okay? Now, why do we see these statements? Because what God is telling us in His Word is that there are very different competing visions of the good. And you need to choose which one you're going to pursue. because they are sort of at ends with each other. And what we're going to see is that sometimes we try to do the really dysfunctional thing of trying to combine the two together, which becomes really weird. All right. So if we kind of follow this as an idea, one of the things that I think is really interesting is the paradox of worldly wisdom. Now, if you think about being worldly, sometimes for example, when we travel overseas, that helps us to become worldly, right? Because you get a bigger vision of the world. You kind of get out from your little provincial, parochial kind of understanding of the world, and then you see things in a bigger way. Hopefully we send you to school so that you get a broader understanding of the world, so that you can become more sophisticated in that regard. Okay? The opposite of being worldly is to be, I don't know, a hick, a bumpkin, a rube, a yokel, a hillbilly, a Hoosier. No, not a Hoosier. Sorry, dear. But all those other things, okay? So when we send you, we don't want to be those things, right? So we kind of want you to expand your vision of the world, okay? The odd thing, the irony, I think, of worldly wisdom is the more you pursue it, actually the more provincial you become. Worldly wisdom is associated only with this world, whereas godly wisdom broadens out from this world to the spiritual. Okay? Worldly wisdom only thinks about a particular time, whereas godly wisdom will always think about things in terms of eternity. So the lie of worldly wisdom, the deception of worldly wisdom is, oh yes, I'm more sophisticated, I'm more suave, I'm more cosmopolitan, but in the end it's really not. Okay? What it really causes you is to become even more provincial, because you become focused more and more solely on self. Now, why does this happen to us? Okay, what is the heart of this worldly wisdom? Turn back to James chapter 3. Because James says the reason that it leads to arrogance and jealousy and strife and division and all these things is that there are three characteristics of worldly wisdom. Okay? The first one is that it is earthly. And when we think of earthly, all James is really saying is here, our heart, our affections are tied to things of this world. Okay? We're not seeing beyond this world, we're seeing only what we can see in this world. Okay? Which leads to the second one, worldly wisdom is sensual or natural. Depending on your translation, the word will be a little bit different there. Now, and I use the word sensual here to kind of underscore the idea that it's tied to the senses. Okay? Normally when we think of sensual, we think of, kind of sexual pleasure or something like that. That's not what James means. All he's saying is it's sort of tied to the senses or to pursuing certain ends. Most of the time it would be things like pursuing pleasure as a good and avoiding pain. Those seem kind of good. I like pleasure. I like to avoid pain. That seems to be kind of natural to us. Hence, it's natural. Okay? Those kind of end up being the goals. Didn't put them up there, right? And the last one is that it is demonic. And what he means by demonic is that the source of worldly wisdom is the exact same thing that caused Satan to rebel. Okay? Satan wanted autonomy. Satan wanted sovereignty over God. Okay? The source of worldly wisdom, because worldly wisdom is self-oriented, the source of worldly wisdom is autonomy and sovereignty. It's the exact same thing. And so James says the source of worldly wisdom is always in the end going to be demonic in this regard. Now, this is abnormal. Okay, this is an abnormal condition for us. Right? God did not create us to be sovereign, independent beings. He did not create us to declare our independence of Him, and He always wanted us to be dependent on Him. Right? So this condition of autonomy is one that if we acknowledge that we're abnormal, then we have to acknowledge why we're abnormal. And that would bring us back to God. Well, the world doesn't want to do that. Right? So what will the world do? The world is going to try and take this abnormal, self-focused vision of what's good and try to normalize it. Try to make it sound like this is the only really true vision of how things should be. So, what happens? We have things like, autonomy starts to become things like independence and self-sufficiency. Those sound sort of virtuous kind of ideas. Selfishness becomes ambition and goal orientation. If we want to quote from that classic 1987 movie, Wall Street, greed is good. Greed clarifies. Greed to continue in the speech where Gordon Gekko is making it in the movie, he says greed has always marked the upward surge of mankind. And that greed will save even this dysfunctional corporation known as the United States of America. Gekko kind of presents this idea of greed as such a virtuous vision that as I practice it individually, and if we all practice it corporately, what will it lead to? Kind of a good outcome for all of us. So the world really does have kind of a vested interest in kind of normalizing this. And so we get books on the virtues of selfishness. We have books saying that selfishness is a genetic thing. And we have little baby girls that say, you can't have any of my dolls. All right. Now, James contrasts this for us. James contrasts worldly wisdom with godly wisdom. And I want you to note that James does not give us sort of the core of godly wisdom, like he did with worldly wisdom. He doesn't tell us, when he said with worldly wisdom, look, it's natural, it's earthly. He doesn't do that with godly wisdom. Okay? Because he assumes that we understand that the source of godly wisdom is God, that it's the character of God. In fact, look at James 1:5 for a minute. If anyone lacks wisdom, what should he do? He should ask. Of who? God. Not your professors. Okay, hopefully they know, but not of knowledgeable people, but the source of real wisdom is going to be God. So he kind of assumes that we know that, because he's kind of laid that out early in the book. He says, if you pursue worldly wisdom, of godly wisdom, this is what happens. Now I want you to kind of, as we go through this list, if you're an astute observer, one of the things that you're going to note is that the list looks an awful lot like the Beatitudes of Matthew chapter 5. And what is Christ laying out in the Beatitudes? The characteristics of citizens of the kingdom. If you're going to be a good citizen of the kingdom, this is how you will act. Here are the moral actions within an ethical vision of community. This is how you're supposed to respond. So, what are they? The first one is that we're pure, that we are single-minded. We keep ourselves unstained from the world, but we also work to do the will of God toward others. Look at James 1:27 for a minute. This is pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father, to visit orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Personal piety, why it's a good thing. If religion is simply defined by personal piety, me keeping my nose clean, that is not godly. It comes from a worldly vision. Because godly wisdom says, yes, I will keep myself from sin, but I also work for the benefit of other people. And we sometimes deceive ourselves when we think personal piety is what being holy is all about. Okay? It's only half of the equation. If it's only half, it's not the whole thing. It becomes worldly. Second one is, it is peaceable. It seeks to reconcile others to Christ and to other people. Okay? Godly wisdom seeks shalom. It seeks restoration. Okay? It seeks to be a peacemaker. Okay? And blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Okay? So there is that part of the vision. They are gentle. Okay? Godly wisdom respects the feelings of others. It is not imposing. It does not force people to believe things. It is not bullying in this regard. And sometimes even in our desire, in our zeal, our religious zeal, to get people to live a certain way, we can be forcible. We can be bullying in how we go about this. Okay? And while we think the goal is good, we are using a worldly way of understanding to try to bring that about, because godly wisdom is gentle in this regard. It is reasonable, okay, which means that you're teachable. You're not arrogant. Okay? You're willing to submit to the teaching and leading of other people. Okay? But it also means that as you try to teach others, you try to show them the reasonableness. Okay? Why a position is good for them, good for others. Okay? Why it fits into the whole community of faith. It's merciful and leads to good fruit. This is the only kind of double one in the group, which I think is kind of interesting. Right? It is compassionate. Godly wisdom is compassionate to those people who are in need of practical help. It deals with needs rather than the source of the problem. Okay? Now, for example, we sometimes think, oh, well, look at the situation he's in. If only he had done this. Okay? That would be a statement that comes out of worldly wisdom, because we're saying, look, he is experiencing the natural consequences of what he has done, okay? And therefore we should just kind of let him in that. Okay? Or if he'd only done this. Again, that would be a worldly wisdom type of statement. Okay? Godly wisdom understands that, you know what? People make mistakes. And sometimes people are affected by the mistakes of others that they didn't even have to make. And we deal with the consequences of need. Why? Because God was merciful to us. If God dealt with us, well, the natural effect of your sin is you're going to hell. We'll all be in hell. So this idea of merciful and good fruits kind of goes together. It is unwavering. It is not, as James said, double-minded. To be unwavering means that you have a single-minded vision of what the good is, and it's this godly one. Okay? And you don't keep flipping back and forth between godly and worldly. Okay? Because if you keep flipping back and forth, you are double-minded, which means that you will be unstable in all of your ways. So James kind of points out we need to have this kind of unwavering view, and it's not hypocritical, which means it's not self-seeking. Sometimes, doing the right thing leads to a good outcome. And so I do it for my benefit. Okay? It leads to a good outcome for me. That's why I'm doing it. Okay? True godly wisdom is really motivated by love for others and not love for self. Now, the end of all of this, James says, is that it will lead to peace and righteousness. Now, I'm sort of running out of time, so I got to hurry up here. All right? But I want to kind of point out the parable of the prodigal son here for a minute, because there's one way of reading this parable that really can be a parable of sort of two wisdoms. And we can kind of look at godly wisdom and worldly wisdom being kind of played out in the parable of the prodigal son. Because remember we said that wisdom is now, or godly wisdom, is the spiritual, mental, and emotional ability to relate rightly to God, rightly to others, and rightly to the culture. If I have a godly vision of things, I am actually in a position to step back and critique the culture and understand whether the culture is moving toward a right goal or not. And we can do that corporately as a body. Now, think about the parable of the prodigal son here for a minute. If you think about the parable of the prodigal son, both of the sons in the beginning of the parable are acting in a worldly fashion. They both have the exact same motivation. Right? The younger son, who's normally the focus of the parable, says to his father, basically, you're dead to me. Okay? I am so self-focused that in my eyes you are dead, and so you might as well just give me the inheritance now because I don't even consider that you're alive to me anymore. Okay? And as the story goes, the father does that. And the younger son goes off and does what with it? He lives decadently, he lives riotously, he splurges, and most of the time we think he has lived a worldly life. And he's now getting the results of his worldliness because he finds himself lying in a pigsty, eating pig pods, and wishing he was back with his father. Because his father is rich, and so he comes to his senses, and what does he do? He goes back home. And in humility, he says to his father, I'm not even worthy to become be considered your son. Just make me a servant. But the father kind of welcomes him and brings him back into the household. Okay, we know that part of the story. Let's consider for a minute the older son. Because the older son is also acting from a sense of worldly wisdom. Now, granted, he is much more conservative in his lifestyle. Okay? He is the good son. He does everything that a good Jewish boy is expected to do. He listens to his father. He works for his father. He does everything that everybody in this little Jewish community would say, you are a good kid. And in fact, everybody in the community probably is patting him on the back. You're the good son. And especially as the tales of the riotous living his brother get back to the village and say, look, he's such a bad kid. Okay? You are a good kid. Okay? In the end, what does he begin to think about himself? I'm, in fact, the good kid. Okay? I'm a good person. But why is he doing all of this? His heart issue really comes back when his brother returns. Because when his brother returns, his father welcomes him into the house, has a party for him. The oldest son finds out what's going on. He won't even go into the house. Right? The oldest son, he's angry. He's angry. He's jealous. He's self-justifying. The father comes out to him and he says to him, all these years I have worked. I've done everything that you've told me to do. I have been the good son. Ask anybody in town. I'm pretty sure that the other people in the village just don't understand the father. Your son called you dead. Okay? You're nuts for bringing him back into your house. Okay? And they're probably telling the older son, you know what? You're right to be angry with your brother. He's an idiot. Okay? You've done everything that you're supposed to do. And by the standards of the community, by the standards of the world, okay, he has been the good son. And he becomes justified in his own mind. Yes, in fact, I am the good son. Why? Because I've done everything that the world tells me to do. Oops. So we have to understand that there is a type of righteousness in the older son. The world gives us a type of righteousness. There is a way of living in the world that seems right, seems virtuous, but it can be a normalizing of the sin nature. And in that respect, and the Bible talks about this, there is a type of righteousness, but in the end it is nothing but filthy rags. Okay? But we can still be convinced it's righteous. Okay? So the question for us as a congregation, I think, in this time of transition that we have, is do we share God's values? Do we share God's heart? Okay? Do we want to see His will done at Shawnee Hills Baptist as it is in heaven? Okay? And we need to somehow avoid becoming like the Corinthians, where the values and attitudes and ideas of what's virtuous in the world somehow work their way into our vision of what's right and good and virtuous here in this congregation. Because at the point that we do that, we will become spiritually very schizophrenic. We will become pretty dysfunctional at that point. Okay? And so I think it really kind of behooves us to kind of look at these two visions of virtue, of right wisdom, okay, and act in accordance. Let's pray. Father, you have said in your word that if we lack wisdom, we should ask. And we really do desire to avoid this kind of schizophrenic response. It's our natural tendency. We saw it in our brothers and sisters at the Church of Corinth. And so we don't want it to produce a type of Christianity that will make us lukewarm, because we know what your response to lukewarm Christianity is. And so we ask, Father, that as we come before you and as we search our own hearts and go through the process of calling a new pastor, that we would do so with your heart and your mind, and that you would bless this endeavor. And we ask it in thy Son's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Stand with us, would you please? We sing together.
Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to me, save that thou art. Thou my best thought by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my light. Be thou my wisdom, and thou my true word. I ever with thee, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, I thy true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Riches I need not, nor man's empty praise. Thou mine inheritance, now and always. Thou and thou only, first in my heart. I, King of heaven, my treasure thou art. I, King of heaven, my victory won. May I reach heaven's joys, so bright and sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all.
Ed, thank you for your message today. Trust you'll take these words, apply them to your own heart, your own life, as you live for Christ throughout this week ahead. I'm going to make just a bit of adjustment here. Those of you who are visitors, I want to allow you an opportunity to slip away from us right now. If you have children over in the children's wing and one of the programs over there, would you go pick them up? Probably got some people over there who would like to get them back to you. Make your way over there, get back over here, join us in about 3 or 4 minutes for a short business meeting here. All right? Thank you. God bless you. Have a good day.